And for more on China-U.S. military ties, we're joined here in the Beijing studio by Professor Xu Hui from China's National Defense University. Welcome, Professor. And also we're joined from Washington, D.C., Ms. Bonnie Glazer, Senior Advisor for Asia and also Freeman Chair in China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Welcome to both of you. First of all, we understand during General Fan Changlong's visit to the United States this time, the so-called army-to-army dialogue mechanism agreement has been signed. Many from outside the militaries from these two countries would wonder, what does this really mean? Ms. Glazer, would you like to elaborate for us a little bit?
Well, I think that there is prospect for the U.S. and Chinese militaries, and particularly armies, for working together. There's been some cooperation, of course, between our navies, such as search and rescue exercises at sea. And armies can work together if there is particularly a natural disaster. China's been more active in working to provide assistance in natural disasters, such as in the Philippines' Haiyan disaster. But I think more broadly, the U.S. and Chinese militaries are trying to build habits of cooperation. So if they actually engage in exercises or in real activities to provide assistance to other nations, this is a positive development.
Habits of cooperation, some suggest this army-to-army mechanism agreement could lead to more military exercise jointly between these two countries. Is it possible? Are we looking at a time frame at all?
Yeah,
Professor Xu.
I think it's quite possible. I think I fully agree with Bonnie's views about both sides want to build a kind of positive relationship between the two militaries. But to the army-to-army dialogue and exchange agreement per se, I think is very important. It could play a role of milestone between the two militaries for the exchange.
Why would you say that?
Why, for instance, in the past, we have several kind of mechanisms between the two navies, and also we're trying to build a kind of rule of engagement for the Air Force and the navies. But to some extent, although we have some cooperation, joint exercises between the two navies, but mainly the mechanism focused on it's a kind of try to avoiding conflict between the ships and the aircraft in the air. So it's different. But for the armies, exchange, I think mainly focused on the positive side. That is how to bring the two armies to work together in dealing with a variety of non-traditional security threats that both to our country and also to the region as well as to the world. I think
it still sounds very abstract to me. What my question really is, if you are talking about, at least experts from both sides are talking about possibilities of a joint military exercise as a result, is there a time frame, is there a possibility of joint military exercise between these two countries? RIMPAC, of course, is one that China joined the United States, but that's a multilateral one. So what about bilateral? With this one, is it really likely to have one?
Yes, actually we could have one, and also the more important thing is not what kind of the exercise itself. More important thing is that could bring the two militaries together, and they can have people-to-people personal contact with each other, knowing each other. That is very important for the two militaries to know the habits, know the way of thinking, and have a confidence and mutual understanding.
How is this, Ms. Glazer, compared to the possibility, as some also suggest, of air-to-air annex of the code of conduct? Some suggest the latter probably is even more important, as it could avoid any kinds of conflict possible in the air between the United States and China.
Well, at the end of last year, when President Obama was in Beijing, for the first time, the two militaries did sign an agreement on avoiding accidents at sea. And this is basically applied to surface naval vessels. And the decision was made at that time to negotiate subsequently an air-to-air annex. Those negotiations started this year, and originally the goal was to complete it at the end of this year. Now, because Xi Jinping will be traveling to the United States and having a state visit in September, that deadline has now been moved up, and both militaries are working hard to try and negotiate this annex before that meeting. This is very important because aircraft from China and the United States are operating in closer proximity with greater frequency than in the past. They need to agree on frequencies that they will communicate so that they can avoid any kind of accidents. And of course, as your listeners well know, in 2001, we had a major accident in which a Chinese pilot died.
So that really leads me to the question, because as you talk about the more and more closer contact between the air forces, one of the things people talk about, Ms. Glaser, is in a way, people say it's amazing. Because on the one hand, China and the United States, at this moment at least, some suggest have not seen eye to eye on the issue of the South China Sea. There are some major differences, at least rhetorically, between the two countries. On the other hand, the two militaries could manage to sign an army-to-army agreement, which is historical, according at least to Professor Xu here in Beijing, and then also talk about air-to-air annex. So how should we understand the two sides of the story, Ms. Glaser?
Well, I think this is really typical of the pattern in the U.S.-China relationship. There are areas where we have common interests and we can actually work together. In the military sphere, both sides have recognized the importance of trying to reduce misperceptions and understanding, to build common ground, and where our interests overlap, actually work together. That's one of the main purposes of this new army-to-army mechanism. So there are areas in which we will continue to have differences, and some of those differences may be very sharp, but dialogue will continue between the militaries to try and avoid any kind of mishap. There will continue to be conflicts of interests, and where there are, we will have to work hard to manage those.
Conflict of interest is one thing, but the visions of the relations between the two militaries is another thing. Professor Xu, I have to ask you this question. It could be a very loaded question, but I have to make sure that our audience understand the context right. So if I could, let me just read through two quotes coming from the two military heads that met this time in the United States. From the Chinese side, of course, Mr. Fan Changlong. He is talking about to develop a kind of new military-to-military relationship between China and the United States. He used several words. One is mutual trust, cooperation, non-conflict, and also sustainability. This is from the Chinese side. From the American side, we have also Mr. Secretary Carter talking about several things. Develop what he said, shared desire to deepen practical cooperation. For example, in the humanitarian areas, peacekeeping, military medicine, and etc. By reading the words coming from both sides, Professor Xu, some might wonder whether the two sides have the same vision of looking at the long-term future together. It seems that the Chinese side are talking about a visionary concept. The U.S. side is talking about, well, let's do just what we can do right now. Yeah. Not necessarily touching on the long future. At least that's what some people have questioned about these two different descriptions. Professor Xu, what is your feeling?
I think you are quite knowledgeable about this background, and we can see this kind of phenomenon has existed for a very long time, since the end of the Cold War. Since then, China, at the very beginning, China want to have a vision for what kind of relationship we want to have, to set up a goal, and then that will be, give us guidelines for the two sides to develop a kind of relationship. So from Jiang Zemin's first visit to the United States after, in 1997 up to now, we put forward a lot of specific, concept, try to defining the relationship
the
nature of the relationship. But on the U.S. side, it's really hard for them to define it. The very reasons I don't know exactly, but maybe it's related with the way of thinking of the American culture. So they prefer to have a kind of from the bottom to the top level, interactions. And then, after interactions in specific areas like HADR, cooperation whatsoever, and let's see what kind of thing we can do together.
Okay.
So, but on the other hand, China wants to have a vision. Just like this time, our President Xi Jinping put forward the new major power relationship.
Exactly.
Also shows the consistency of the Chinese side. I think both sides have different approaches, but the ultimate goal is try to avoid conflict, avoid confrontation, and mutual respect for cooperation, for providing the common goods for the Asia-Pacific region.
You're talking for the Chinese side, I
Yes.
guess. You can't talk for the U.S. side. We'll have Ms. Glazer to
Right.
talk from the U.S. side. What about the visionary goal? Can we work on that while at the same time work on what the U.S. sides have suggested, some practical so-called cooperation? Without a visionary goal, isn't that dangerous for both sides?
No, I actually agree with Xu Hui. This is in part cultural. The United States doesn't really care very much for labels or principles. The United States really wants concrete action. And I think the fact that, for example, the U.S. and China have agreed to observe the Code of Unplanned Encounters at Sea, and recently there were 2 ships that encountered each other unexpectedly in the South China Sea, and they implemented the provisions that are included in this agreement. So it shows that there really is value in concrete cooperation. From the U.S. point of view, whether you talk about the new type of major power relationship or the new type of military-to-military relationship, these are aspirations. Just because we declare, or Xi Jinping declares that he wants them, doesn't mean that they exist. So from the U.S. point of view, we have to actually engage in a lot of work.
Right.
Get down dirty and
roll up
work
the
on
sleeves,
doing things together, and actually build a better relationship. In the military sphere, I think we have to be pragmatic. Both militaries are still planning, in the worst case, to fight a war against each other, and that's not something that's likely to change in the near future.
Let me ask one final question before we go, Professor Xu, because what you both have just analyzed very vividly reflect a reality. That is, the U.S.-China relations, including the military ties, at times have to be rescued by the very top leadership of the 2 countries. We see the top meetings between the 2 presidents usually bring the warm atmosphere to a relationship that's constantly being challenged by all kinds of difficulties, whether it's political or military or even economic. So the question is, what can be the role of the militaries if we are really looking at long term from both sides? Well, the military is not just looking at its own interests, but also the interests of the bilateral relations, Professor.
Okay, first of all, let me respond to Bonnie's views
Briefly,
about aspiration. I think it's very important. Only when you have an aspiration to build that kind of partnership, you can have it. Otherwise, you just depend on sleep dreaming. That would be very dangerous. It would be off track. So from this point of view, we can see both the leaders, President Obama and President Xi Jinping, have the aspiration and also have the visions. So for the military, and I think should fully understand their aspirations and try to work together for that. Why? Because I believe that U.S.-China relationship is the most important relationship, not only in the region, but also in the world. And we can see that in the past 3 decades, a stable, workable, mature, and consistent U.S.-China relationship actually played the role as the linchpin for Asia-Pacific security, and that provide the public goods for all of the countries that in these areas and benefit all of the others. So we have every reason to have a consistent, cooperative, and constructive mil-to-mil relationship, which is an integral, important part of the bilateral relations.
Well, we have every reason to do that, but we'll be able to do that. That's another question.
Yes,
but
I agree
certainly, both sides needs to try. I could tell both of you are being very passionate this time in our conversation and debate. We want to thank both of you, Professor Xu Hui from China National Defense University in Beijing, and also Ms. Bonnie Glaser from CSIS based in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much, Ms. Glaser and Professor Xu.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.